In an Irish woodland, a researcher pulls up camera trap footage and sees something that makes no sense. Grey squirrel sightings have been dropping for years in this exact forest patch. No poison, no trapping team, no culling budget. Nothing was done. For 150 years, grey squirrels had spread across Britain and Ireland, wiping out red squirrels, outlasting millions in conservation funding. And then, in forests where one quiet native predator was recovering, the grey squirrel started collapsing. Nobody planned it. The animal that ended the invasion had been living in the forest the whole time. Humans just hadn't noticed. The image on the screen is barely legible. Shot at night, the camera set low on a fallen log, the timestamp ticking in the corner. A shape moves through the frame, russet brown, long-bodied, moving with the kind of low, unhurried speed that belongs to something not afraid of being seen because it rarely is. The pine marten holds the frame for about 3 seconds. Then it is gone, back into the dark between the trees. Nothing else moves. And on those same cameras, across that same woodland, grey squirrel detections had been falling for months, year after year, without anyone doing anything about it. This was not supposed to be a recovery story. For most of the 20th century, the grey squirrel problem in Britain and Ireland was treated as something you managed, not something you solved. Grey squirrels arrived from North America in 1876. The first animals were released at Henbury Park in Cheshire, a private estate. A landowner who thought they would make decorative additions to his grounds, no concept of what he was starting. They spread slowly at first, exploring hedgerows and woodland corridors. Then faster. Then with the consistency of something that has found a system it is perfectly suited to inhabit and that has nothing left to resist it. By the end of the 20th century, grey squirrels had occupied roughly 3/4 of their potential range across the United Kingdom. Red squirrels, animals that had lived in British and Irish woodlands since the last ice age, had been pushed into a few northern Scottish strongholds, scattered pockets of northern England, and a handful of isolated sites in Ireland. The response was what anyone would reach for: trap, cull, repeat. Conservation organizations built grey squirrel control zones around the remaining red squirrel refugia, maintaining managed buffers where grey squirrel numbers were actively suppressed. Supplementary feeding stations helped red squirrels compete for food. Disease monitoring programs tracked the spread of squirrel pox virus, a pathogen that grey squirrels carry without any visible symptoms and that kills red squirrels within weeks of exposure. Millions of pounds and euros were committed across decades of organized, staffed effort. Local programs worked. While teams were actively trapping and maintaining the zone, grey squirrel numbers stayed down and red squirrels held on. Then the budget was cut. Or the team was reassigned, or the funding cycle ended, and the grey squirrels came back, without exception, every single time. It failed, not because the people running those programs were incompetent or uncommitted. It failed because they were attacking the symptom. The actual cause, the cause hiding underneath a century and a half of invasion, was something most people had completely stopped being able to see. Here is what makes the whole story strange. The grey squirrel did not win because it was a stronger, smarter, or more adaptable animal. It won because it walked into a broken system. A system that had been missing a critical piece for 300 years before the first grey squirrel ever set foot on British soil. The grey squirrel didn't beat the red squirrel. It beat a broken ecosystem. One where the referee had already been removed. The pine marten, Martes martes, is native to Britain and Ireland. It belongs here the way the red squirrel belongs here, the way the sessile oak and the Atlantic hazel belong here. A low, sinuous, largely nocturnal member of the mustelid family related to the otter, the weasel, and the stoat, it moves through woodland hunting small mammals, birds, eggs, insects, and fruit, quick enough to take a rabbit, patient enough to raid a nest, comfortable both in the treetops and on the forest floor. For thousands of years, the pine marten was a functional part of British and Irish forest ecosystems. and red squirrels shared those forests with it, successfully, across millennia. Then came the fur trade. Then came centuries of gamekeeper persecution as estates managing pheasant and grouse shoots classified pine martens as vermin to be eliminated. Then came the trapping, the shooting, the poisons set for other animals that took pine martens just as readily as anything else. The destruction was systematic and it was thorough. By the early 20th century, pine martens had been eliminated from most of England and Wales and reduced to a small remnant population in the remote northwest of Scotland and a few isolated pockets of rural Ireland, functionally gone from the vast majority of the landscape. Nobody at the time connected that loss to anything happening with squirrels. Why would they? Pine martens were gone from most of Britain long before grey squirrels began their real expansion. The invasion and the predator loss were completely separate human decisions, separated by centuries. But they produced a compounding result, an invasive species from a different continent with no natural enemies in the new ecosystem it was entering, spreading through a landscape where even the native predators that might have checked it had already been removed. The grey squirrel wasn't just an invader. It was an invader that had walked into a system where its natural check had already been dismantled 200 years earlier. The ecosystem had been broken twice, once when the predator was hunted to the edge of extinction, and again when the invasive species arrived into the vacuum left behind. This is the damaged baseline problem, and it runs through the entire story. People looking at British and Irish woodlands in the mid-20th century saw what appeared to be a natural competition between two squirrel species, one winning, one losing. It looked like the inevitable outcome of a biological contest. What they were actually seeing was the product of two separate cascading failures, stacked on top of each other, playing out in a landscape where almost nobody alive was old enough to remember what the functional system had looked like before either disaster. The dry creek looked like the natural creek. The predator void looked like the natural state, and the grey squirrel's dominance looked like an inevitability when it was actually an accident, a gap left by human decisions, filled by a species that had never been designed to fill it. Almost nobody in Britain or Ireland had ever seen a woodland with pine martens at meaningful population density alongside thriving red squirrels. The broken version was the only version anyone knew, and that made the damage invisible, which is how a researcher named Dr. Emma Sheehy ended up staring at data that did not add up. Sheehy was not on a mission to rehabilitate the pine marten. She was not arriving at field surveys with a predetermined conclusion. She was doing what ecologists do, working through population data for grey squirrels across Irish woodland sites, trying to understand what was driving changes in distribution and abundance. And she kept finding the same uncomfortable pattern. In certain woodland sites, grey squirrel numbers were declining without any active management program in place. No poison, no trapping, no coordinated culling effort. The land had not obviously changed, but the grey squirrels were fewer. And in those same sites, something else had shifted. Pine marten camera trap detections were meaningfully higher than in comparison sites where grey squirrel numbers remained stable or growing. She could not ignore it, but she also could not simply accept it. Correlation is not causation, and she worked through the alternative explanations carefully. Maybe the declining grey squirrel sites had lower food availability. Maybe woodland structure was producing different squirrel densities independent of any predator pressure. Maybe a localized disease event specific to those areas had nothing to do with martens at all. She controlled for the variables she could access. The pine marten signal kept holding. Statistically significant, consistent across multiple sites, pointing in the same direction every time she looked. She published the findings in 2018 in Proceedings of the Royal Society. B. The paper's title made no attempt to be subtle. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. The data showed a statistically significant negative relationship between pine marten relative abundance and grey squirrel relative abundance across the Irish woodland sites surveyed. And, critically, a positive relationship between pine marten abundance and red squirrel recovery in those same areas. More martens, fewer grey squirrels, more red squirrels filling the space that opened up. The conservation community was cautious, reasonably so. Pine martens eat squirrels, both kinds. The immediate challenge was obvious. Wouldn't a generalist predator simply reduce both squirrel populations without discrimination? Wouldn't it make the red squirrel problem worse before making it better? This is where the bottleneck becomes visible. The pine marten and the red squirrel have shared the same forests for thousands of years. They have been neighbors under the same selective pressures across an evolutionary time frame that built behavioral relationships nobody designed but that natural selection continuously refined. The red squirrel is smaller and lighter, roughly 270 to 340 grams, and faster in the high canopy where it is harder to catch. Research has suggested it may carry behavioral adaptations to pine marten presence, patterns of vigilance, escape routes through the upper canopy, responses to predator cues that were shaped over millennia of coexistence. Whether those responses are genetically fixed or behaviorally learned remains an active area of study. But the functional result in the field data is not subtle. The gray squirrel is a different story. Weighing roughly 500 to 600 grams, heavier and less agile in the high canopy, it evolved in North America across millions of years that contained no pine martens. It has no fear response to the pine marten. None. No instinctive alarm that fires when it detects marten scent on a log. No evolved flight route to the upper canopy. It forages heavily on the ground, exactly where pine martens hunt most effectively, and it behaves, in the presence of an approaching marten, the way an animal behaves when it simply does not know what is about to happen. A pine marten moving through a woodland does not need to hunt down every gray squirrel in its territory to change the outcome. It does not need to cause mass mortality or run a visible campaign. What the Irish data suggests is that even relatively modest pine marten densities are sufficient to reduce gray squirrel breeding success enough that the population cannot maintain itself. Kits are taken, nests are raided, recruitment drops below replacement rate. The gray squirrel population cannot grow fast enough to hold its ground. Meanwhile, the red squirrel, lighter, faster, less exposed, and apparently less catchable, keeps breeding into the competitive space that opens up around it. The pine marten does not know it is doing any of this. It is just hunting. It is finding gray squirrels because gray squirrels are easier to find and easier to catch than red squirrels. The asymmetry is not a strategy. It is an evolutionary accident, except from the red squirrel's perspective, where it looks exactly like the restoration of the relationship the forest had always been designed to run. That is the leverage. Not force, not scale, not a massive program with a central budget. A single ecological relationship, dormant for 300 years, reactivating. But here is the part that almost nobody was tracking in real time. Pine martens were legally protected. In Ireland, under the Wildlife Act 1976. In Britain, under the Wildlife and Countryside Act 1981. The deliberate persecution that had nearly wiped them out was, at least officially, stopped. And with the killing stopped, pine marten populations, from whatever small base had survived in the remotest corners of the landscape, began to recover. Slowly, over decades. Particularly in Ireland, where suitable woodland and reduced persecution pressure allowed numbers to rebuild from a very low base without anyone coordinating the result. They came back the way nocturnal animals come back, invisibly. You do not notice a recovering pine marten population the way you notice a red kite circling over a motorway or an osprey returning to a nest that naturalists have been watching for decades. Pine martens move at the dark edge of things. They turn up on camera traps as 3-second shadows. They leave prints in soft mud beside forest streams. They are present in a woodland the way evidence of something is present in a place, only visible if you know how to read the signs, only striking once you understand what was missing before. And wherever they crossed a density threshold, wherever enough of them were established to actually suppress gray squirrel recruitment across a breeding season, the gray squirrels started losing ground. Without any management program coordinating it, without any conservation body planning the outcome, without a single trap being set or a single bait station being maintained. No plan, no budget, no team. The predator doing the job the ecosystem had been waiting 3 centuries to have done. The University of Aberdeen, where Sheehy was based, published a press release on the findings from 2018. The Irish Research Council documented the researchers' impact, describing how native pine marten recovery was generating what researchers called biotic resistance to the invasive grey squirrel, meaning the natural predator was providing population control that no culling program had ever managed to deliver in a sustainable or scalable form. The findings were peer-reviewed, published in a leading journal, and based on field data from multiple sites. They were not a local anecdote or a hopeful observation. They were a documented mechanism in the scientific record. Corroboration began appearing from Scottish woodland monitoring. The picture there is more complex. Grey squirrels have been established in parts of Scotland much longer than in Ireland. Woodland types differ across the range, and pine marten recovery in Scotland has its own trajectory and history. The Scottish data points in the same direction as the Irish findings, but with more variation around it. That is not a failure of the hypothesis. That is what a real ecological mechanism looks like when it is tested across landscapes that are not identical. And in Wales, the Vincent Wildlife Trust had been working on pine marten reintroduction since 2015, moving individuals from Scottish populations into Welsh woodland where the animals had been functionally absent for most of the 20th century. Monitoring was ongoing. Pine martens need time to establish territories, to breed and build local density, to reach the threshold where suppression effects can be measured across a population. The early Welsh monitoring data has been directionally consistent with the Irish pattern. It is not yet the same proof replicating in a third landscape, but it is the same story beginning again in a third place. This is how a real ecological principle spreads, not through one triumphant result. Through a finding in Ireland, corroboration in Scotland, a reintroduction trial in Wales, and monitoring programs slowly building the case that the mechanism is not a local accident but a recoverable relationship. And then came the part nobody had promised going in. In the Irish woodland sites with the highest pine marten populations, where grey squirrel numbers had dropped most steeply and most consistently, researchers were also tracking red squirrel populations. What they found was not just that red squirrels were surviving better in those areas. Red squirrels were actively recovering. In zones without supplementary feeding programs running, without parallel grey squirrel culling operations alongside them, without the full intervention infrastructure that had been assumed for decades to be the minimum condition for red squirrel persistence in grey squirrel territory. The competitive pressure on red squirrels was dropping because the competitive pressure from grey squirrels was dropping. And red squirrels, given competitive space, use it. They breed, they disperse, they recolonize woodland they had retreated from years or decades earlier. They do not need human assistance to do any of that. They just need the competition reduced enough that their own reproductive capacity can work. For decades, the standard framework of red squirrel conservation had been built on the assumption of permanent manual intervention. Protect the red squirrels directly, suppress the grey squirrels continuously, maintain both efforts indefinitely. In the high marten zones in Ireland, that entire structure was being quietly replaced by an ecological process that costs nothing to operate, and that becomes more effective as the predator population continues to grow. The pine marten was not just suppressing the grey squirrel, it was rebuilding the red squirrel's competitive position from inside the system, passively, continuously, for free, in a way that 50 years of organized intervention had never achieved at landscape scale. This does not work everywhere. That has to be said plainly, because the story is only believable if the limits are honest. Pine martens need woodland of sufficient size and connectivity to support territories and allow density to build. They need a diverse prey base so their populations are not dependent on squirrel abundance alone. They need legal protection that is meaningfully enforced, and in areas where illegal persecution continues, particularly on some managed shooting estates, pine marten recovery remains suppressed. Squirrel pox virus still circulates in the landscape. The pine marten reduces the gray squirrel population that carries the virus, but it does not eliminate squirrel pox. Red squirrels in recovering zones still face disease risk, and predator recovery does not solve that risk alone. In urban and suburban environments, in heavily fragmented woodland, in landscapes dominated by intensive agriculture with little structural connectivity, this model simply does not apply. The solution does not work everywhere, and that is exactly why it works where it does. The conditions in rural Ireland aligned in a specific combination. Legal protection had been in place long enough for pine marten numbers to rebuild from a surviving remnant. Suitable woodland was present and connected enough for territories to form and hold. And gray squirrel populations, while well established, had not yet locked so deeply into the landscape that a recovering predator could not tip the balance. Think about what the contrast looks like in practice. Decades of culling programs across Britain and Ireland required continuous staffing, continuous funding, continuous maintenance, and produced results that evaporated the moment the effort stopped. The pine marten recovery in Ireland happened because a law passed in 1976 ended the killing that had nearly eliminated them. No deployment, no maintenance cycle, no budget line for the suppression effect itself. The predator found the woodland found the predator. The relationship that had existed for thousands of years before anyone interrupted it began reassembling itself, one territory at a time. The paper that documented this was titled, "The Enemy of My Enemy is My Friend." An old strategic idea applied to a real ecological problem that had been treated as insoluble for a century and a half. What the data showed was not that pine martens had been deployed as a conservation tool. It was that pine martens, simply by recovering, were delivering a conservation outcome that intentional human programs had never managed to achieve at scale. The solution was not engineered. It was released the moment the persecution that had suppressed it was finally stopped. That is the part that is hardest to absorb. The answer was not invented. It was not the product of a breakthrough program or a new technology or a clever management strategy. It was an evolutionary relationship between a predator and its prey, encoded across thousands of years in the biology of both animals that had been working exactly as designed until humans interrupted it. And when the interruption finally stopped, the relationship started working again. There is a camera trap in an Irish woodland tonight, mounted on a log at the edge of a stand of mature oak, recording whatever moves through the dark. In 3 seconds of footage, a pine marten moves through the frame, low, fast, unhurried, already gone before the shutter finishes cycling. In that same woodland, gray squirrel activity is a fraction of what it was 10 years ago. Red squirrel prints appear in the soft earth at the base of the trees. No trapping team came through here. No poison was laid, no culling budget was spent. For 150 years, Britain and Ireland tried to solve the gray squirrel problem by attacking the gray squirrel. The actual solution was already living in the forest. It just needed humans to stop killing it.